My name is Carl Northrop, and I'm the founding member of a small law firm called Telecommunications Law Professionals. And we're here to talk about the paging industry, which takes us back a ways. And one of the reasons I'm here is because I joined a gentleman called Norman Jorgensen back in 1976. And he was in many respects the father, or one of the father lawyers of the paging industry. He actually formed the National Association of Radio Telephone Systems, which is the predecessor to NARS, predecessor to Telecator, which became the Paging Industry Association. And all my professional practice, I've represented wireless companies, starting with paging. So that's why I'm here, but I'd like for everybody on the panel to kind of say what they're doing here and what they had to do with paging.
Hi, Marty Cooper. I've been in the wireless industry from the very beginning of what wireless was, I think. And I introduced the first high-capacity pagers. Seems like 100 years ago, but it was only, what year was it?
70.
Huh?
70.
Yeah, right around 1970
maybe.
were the first high-capacity pagers. And I also introduced the first mobile telephone right around the same time, around 1973.
Oh, and I grew up in a family mobile telephone business, and in about 1972, my father recruited me back to the business because the paging beeper business was starting, and so I cut my teeth on beepers till 1983 when Cellular started.
Well, and let me say, so Arlene's family's company was called Industrial Communications, and it really was, until the nationwide paging company and PageNet came along, the largest paging company in the country. And it was incredibly successful and very innovative in a lot of respects. Jay?
Yeah, I'm Jai Bhagat. I met Jai Courtney, who was, again, one of the leading FCC practicing attorney in the radio common carrier field, what we talk about in the aging industry. That was my first job, helping out FCC applications from a technical aspect. You know, there used to be issues on the interference and mutually exclusive applications. I moved on to then with a consulting company called Detra Communications. This company basically did engineering work for about 90% of the paging companies in the country. And then I moved on to New York, where I worked for a company called Air Signal. Air Signal was one of the big companies back in 1980s. And I stayed there for, I think, 3 years, and then got pulled by John Palmer, who is a big name in our industry, who is known to be really entrepreneur and thinker, who came up with the idea of nationwide paging back in early 80s. He pulled me into Jackson, Mississippi, and I joined MCCA, and where I had some interactions with Arlene, and being in the same market, we were in Los Angeles, and we were both on the board of Telecator at that time. And I went on to become the chairperson for Telecator in '95. After MCCA was sold out to Bell South in '85, John Palmer and I started a new company called SkyTel, which became the name in paging, taking paging to the next revolution of messaging. We were the first one to introduce text messaging in the country, which everybody knows where text messaging is worldwide. So all my life I have done nothing but paging and messaging, and here I am again talking about that.
One of the things I think of when I think of the paging industry is one of the very first assignments that I had as a young attorney was filing a petition with the FCC asking them to convert a series of mobile telephone channels to paging, because this is before cellular. And mobile telephone was a terrible business. The capacity of the systems was so little that you couldn't get many subscribers on. You know, people would put a transmitter on the top of the Empire State Building and it would knock out the signal for 20 miles in every direction. And you could have one mobile telephone call on one channel, you know, throughout all New York City when that was going on. And there were a number of mobile channels, but they weren't that many. So it wasn't until all of the frequencies from cellular came along that the two-way business, you know, really made any sense. And so we actually petitioned the FCC to convert two-way channels to paging so that we could have more paging spectrum. And they didn't do that, but they agreed that you could do as much paging as you wanted on a two-way channel as long as you had it so it would go into storage when there was a mobile call going on. So people would put paging on a mobile telephone channel, they would put 2 mobile units on the channel, and the rest of it would be, you know, kind of all paging. Now, tell me if I'm wrong. My recollection is that Homer may have had like 100,000 customers on the guard band.
I can tell
No,
you.
that was the guard band.
The guard band, yeah. Well,
Yeah,
that was
but
the
that,
shared-
that wasn't
Yeah,
for
that
Yeah,
was- that was the shared guard band.
MCC had tons of these UHF two-way channels.
Right.
And like you said, you build one US channel, you put up a big transmitter, and with the system we had, the technology we had, only one person could talk at a time on that channel. And the overall capacity was, of the one frequency was very limited, 50, 60 in a market. So it really practically did not make, from the spectrum point of view and from the economic point of view, to do two-way mobile telephone there. So everybody, regardless of what the FCC rules were, we got to do two-way on that. Everybody was using those channels by paging, and just to be totally legal, they will have one mobile on the frequency that you are providing the two-way service. So that was the catch. You need to have at least one.
And that mobile was often given to an employee of the company with instructions, whatever you do, don't use this. Well, one of the things that I think about is kind of the transition over time. I mean, early on, nobody wanted to use anything other than the VHF frequencies. And then the UHF frequencies, they slowly got developed, but it really wasn't until George Perrin came along and formed PageNet that he really developed the 900 megahertz spectrum.
We were the first one.
Oh, you were the first? Okay.
Skytel was the first one to petition the FCC for the 900, and that's where we petitioned the FCC for two-way.
Oh, okay.
And we were the first one to file for the pioneer preference at the FCC for two-way messaging, and we were given the pioneer's preference by the U.S. Congress.
That makes sense.
So Skytel was the first one to bring in a 900 megahertz band to the marketplace.
Marty, do you want to talk a little bit about how the equipment changed over time in the paging business?
Well, before you talk about the paging business, you have to define what the paging business is, Carl.
Okay.
And the beginnings of paging are kind of fuzzy. The first pagers were actually conducted by a fire department in Detroit somewhere around the time that radio was invented.
Oh, wow.
I have no idea how they reached out to people. I have no idea how the first inventor of paging actually did selective calling, because at the time he did that, the transistor had not been invented in 1949.
Oh, wow.
But he managed to put a paging system in the Jewish hospital in New York. There's no history of how that worked, but there is a history, especially in my mind, about the first commercial paging system that went into Mount Sinai Hospital, also in New York.
Well, and doctors were always users of pagers, and frankly, as the industry started to transition to cellular, doctors were kind of the last hurrah when it came to the paging business.
Well, they still
Yeah, I
are the
understand.
primary users of, but the doctors weren't always in favor of a paging. Remember, paging has two effects. One is it makes professionals available when you needed them, when there's a crisis. But some of the professionals didn't like being that available.
Right.
So it took time to convince people that paging was a way to make them operate more efficiently.
Yeah. Well,
And
I think the one
and
big
so,
reason.
Motorola responded to that, and we built a system before the transistor was could be used at radio frequencies, even in the low band, never mind 900 megahertz, as Jay pointed out. And so we introduced a product called low frequency paging.
Okay.
It used 100 kilohertz
Oh, wow.
as the radio frequency. We tested the thing, worked perfectly. The way this worked was with a loop around the building, maybe one on every floor, and it worked by induction. You know, if you take two wires and put them next to each other, the fields, the RF, the magnetic fields would move from one wire to another. So we were not even using radio transmission. We installed this system. Our prediction was that it would work at least 95 to 99% of the time. We thought that was just wonderful performance. The first thing that happened is we get a report that some doctor missed a page and took his beautiful pager that we had created and threw it against the wall. So we went back to the Mount Sinai Hospital to look at, maybe we were premature. We'll take the system back and try to improve the performance so your doctors will appreciate that. And they said, absolutely not. We cannot conduct our hospital today without paging service.
They wouldn't let you take it away. Oh, wow.
They would not let us take that away. So it just gives you, I have to tell you also about the technology. You think about technology in the form of transistors and high performance things. When we came up with these first pagers from Mount Sinai Hospital, we just had to make a housing for the pager. You couldn't do injected molding. The only person we found that could manage to make a housing that we could use for this pager made the core for toilet paper rolls. So that's the very first pagers we delivered were literally toilet paper coils. So the bottom line is that we did end up replacing the Mount Sinai Hospital and moved on to what was called the Page Boy 1, which was our RF. And this was, in fact, this is an example of the...
Page Boy 1 pager was, one of the best pagers which came out in the marketplace during that time. It was so popular.
Well, and I remember one of my clients, this is Mark Stashew of Metro PCS, he made a comment which has always stuck with me. He said, the amazing thing about the iPhone was basically how long it lasted and has continued to last. Because in the paging world, I mean, every year there was the new hot item. And so it would go from one thing to the next. Along would come the razor, along would come another. And, it was constantly overturning. You couldn't have a piece of equipment that didn't seem to be at the top of the list for more than a year.
And cellular.
Well, no, cellular. I mean, the iPhone, it evolved, but I mean, the iPhone's been around forever. But the change the hot pager was changing every year.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at even the capacity of the network at the speed and the battery life, paging made tremendous progress. If you look at back in 80, on a frequency, Arlene, remember we had a two-tone pager?
Two-tone, five-tone, six-tone.
Two-tone first. Capacity was
exactly.
only 100 users on that frequency. Then we would with 5-tone, got up to 1,000. Then we went up to digital. Then eventually, when we went with the SkyTel two-way network, we had basically unlimited. We went from the speed of, the one before that was the 800 megabits per second. And with the two-way, we took a quantum jump to 24,000.
Wow.
24,000.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me when paging started out, it was a real-time service. And so you would place the call and it would go out right at that time. And wasn't one of the major revolutions when they got to store and forward? Because that's when, we could have all these pagings go into queue.
Sure. What happened was there were restrictions, artificial restrictions, because of the Carterphone decision, that you could not connect a device directly to the paging terminal. So you had to get a buffer.
Right.
This is before the decision or MFJ was modified to
Right.
have AT&T allow carriers or companies to directly connect with their equipment.
Right.
So they had to go through this device, and so that created store and forward. For example, that was very popular in voice paging.
Right.
If people will leave a message and
Dispatch.
they will go sequentially. And sometimes what happened is, it happened to our customer. Something happened to the storing device, voice messaging storing device, and they fixed it, and then the next day, the old messages start going out. And somebody got a message, Mr. Kenny, sorry to report your uncle died. Well, the man had been to the funeral. But those were sometimes the artificial restrictions placed by the regulatory authorities over paging. And, once they opened up direct dial, you could dial directly. That changed the whole thing, not only to the paging, what we had back on the two-way frequencies for mobile, the UHF channel we were talking about. Now people could directly dial a number to the car before they had to go through operator to patch it.
Well, and we should also talk a little about tone paging, tone plus voice paging. I mean, it evolved over time and just became much more sophisticated.
Well, let me tell you, Carl, it started even less sophisticated than you mentioned. The very first, what you would call a paging system, was nothing more than an operator coming on the air every 5 minutes, repeating a list of numbers. Each customer had a number, and you just had a radio receiver. You turn it on every 5 minutes or whatever you thought you might be getting a page, and listen to the list of numbers. And if you heard your number, you would look around for
I
the
had
nearest.
no idea.
Yeah, this is before they had
the
the
nearest
selective paging.
telephone booth. You remember when
Yeah.
only you and I, Carol, would remember what a telephone booth is. But if you think about the evolution, that was the very first what you would call paging. The first selective pagers are the ones we were talking about that beeped. And they was evolved to not just one beep. You would have up to 4 different beeps.
Right.
Yeah.
And what was the year approximately that that pager came into existence?
76,
76? Yeah, that's so.
75, 76.
I think that was the time of Page Boy 1, I think, right?
Page Boy 2.
Page Boy 2, yes.
Yeah, that one,
Well,
Okay.
the white one.
and that evolved to a pager that had audio on it. And then the next thing you know, we worked out ways of having a display on it.
Digital page.
So you could get more than just 4 different numbers. And then the two-way pager, as Jay pointed out.
We also had the alphanumeric in between the display pager and the two-way. We had the alphanumeric. Motorola was the big one in the alphanumeric pager.
The one-way paging and the devices that Motorola was delivering were starting to come right at the time that we were launching Cellular. Mm-hmm. So that work was going on in the early 80s.
Right.
And when I went on to work in Cellular, our ICS was starting to page alphanumeric paging. Mm-hmm. And the issue there was that you still had to have dispatch. Mm-hmm. Because there was no way, we didn't have the internet to be able to connect to. So we had our paging operators for our mobile tone and voice paging now starting to dispatch alphanumeric pagers because you had to key it in. Mm-hmm. And companies like National Dispatch emerged. I was on their board, who who were providing operator services to almost all the paging companies that were doing one-way alphanumeric paging, because otherwise there was no way to get your message on the network.
The telephone answering services went hand in hand with
There you go.
with the paging carrier, because even if the doctors got a voice message, they always preferred to call back and get their messages from the operator. They wanted to talk to a human person, and sometimes you can't leave all the details. What if a person will leave with an operator, so the operator can relay it back to the doctor. So, those were really essential services. I miss talking to human operator now. Every time I call someone, I can't talk to anyone and get frustrated. Those TES
Even
services,
today,
they were really, really fantastic.
And I will say, in the early days, probably 60% of the paging clients that our law firm had were in the telephone answering business. That was their main business,
Yeah.
and paging was a sideline.
Yeah.
And the other ones were in the mobile telephone
Yeah,
business,
that's true.
like us. Yeah, exactly. The thing that's so remarkable to me when people talk about the history of cellular, and of course now kids have no idea what cellular was even before the iPhone, right? It's all about data and so on. But when I look back over my whole career at what was going on and the pieces of technology and pieces of the cultural and business changes that went on during paging was absolutely precedent to cellular, because you've got the licensing, you've got the coverage, you've got the distribution, you've got the marketing that you have to do, you've got managing customers that are mobile. All of that fed into the beginning of cellular, and oftentimes there is no credit given to the work that went on for those primarily about the first 10 years of high-capacity paging, when we had the guard band channels.
And I will say one of my proudest achievements as an attorney was, I represented a lot of paging companies pre-cellular, and they weren't really following cellular and the cellular proceeding and all that kind of stuff. And I reached out to all of them, and I said, you have got to file a cellular application, because, this is where the business is going to be going. And so remember that when cellular was filed, the top 30 markets in the United States were all filed on one day.
Yes.
And every application had to be an entire direct case. They thought there were going to be oral hearings. So a typical cellular application would be 1, 2, or 3 books of this size. One would be engineering. One would be background on the company, and the other would be kind of their proposal for the market. I filed 16 applications in the top 30 markets for paging companies, and every one of them went on to have at least a piece of, a cellular market, and it kept them alive, because the paging business just didn't.
Arlene and I can tell you the big history of what you were talking about, because we were actively involved in ground one filing.
Right.
We were both in filing in LA.
LA, yeah.
Well, I'd like to remind you that this is a paging
No, I understand.
history.
No, I understand.
And you should know that it's very interesting that the beginning of high-capacity paging came from the Bell system, believe it or not. They were not my favorite people, as you well know. I spent my whole life bucking the Bell system. But the very first proposal for high-capacity paging came from Bell Laboratories. And they came out and told us that the time was ready to have really high capacity. And they were looking for vendors to produce the Bell system paging system. Their version of this thing had a terminal with a capacity of 3,000 pagers. And we came back and proposed that this was really not a big enough number.
Right.
And we had a vision of an industry that could support tens or hundreds of thousands. So they raised their number from 3,000 to 6,000. So as you know, we ended up building not only the pagers, a pager that looked like this, with that was a high-capacity pager, but the very first terminal that we introduced had a capacity of 100,000 pagers.
Do you remember the name? I do.
The Metro 100.
Metro 1.
and, which is brilliant marketing, right?
Right.
Except, Carl, we
had one.
we never figured out who was going to buy that terminal. And it turns out that our potential customers are all little paging providers, like Jai Bhagat over there. And nobody could even imagine buying a system that had a capacity of 100,000.
Yeah.
So fortunately, our salespeople dug around and found a crazy guy in California named Homer Harris.
Right.
And he had the vision to think this is going to be a big business. And he figured out a way of not only providing the service on this terminal that we provided, but sharing this terminal with other smaller providers like Jai. And that was really the beginning of high-capacity paging. And that ended up resulting in an industry that ended up with 61 million pagers worldwide.
And the other thing that always interested me about the paging business is, so Bell Telephone really had an opportunity to be huge in the paging business because it had spectrum and other things, and it never really ever developed it. I mean, I know in LA, they were, and also ran compared to industrial and others, and that was true in most places that I was.
Well, let me tell you a story about that, because this is interesting. Sometime in that 70s time frame, my dad, first of all, you can remember when we were complaining to the California Commission that we were being, our lines that were going into our paging terminal, the Metro 100, were being sabotaged by the telephone companies. We had lines coming in from all over the LA basin and out and around. And more often than not, there'd be an outage every day in these lines, which caused problems for all of our customers. So my dad got the idea that somehow he got wind that Bell, Pac Bell, and GTE in West LA and Santa Monica were colluding to get back into paging. Mm-hmm. And they did discovery on those Bell companies, and the orders came down, I think, from the Public Utilities Commission in California that kept them both out of the market for 5 years. So we stopped them in LA. But I think that there were better penetration of the Bell system in other markets, but it was very blotchy. You know, there wasn't a commitment to wireless communications inside the Bell system.
Well, and one of the things that a lot of people don't realize or remember is, so in the early days, and Norm Jorgensen was really active in this, we still had state regulation of the paging business. This was before preemption by the FCC, in which they said you can't, you can't regulate entry and rates. And I mean, a lot of paging companies basically got the local PUC to say that it was a regulated monopoly. So several of the clients that I had in my first years of practice, they were the only paging company in town because they had the only state certificate and you couldn't get another one. In order to get a certificate, an example would be the state of Tennessee. In order to get a certificate in the state of Tennessee, you had to go through an oral hearing and prove that the existing service was not meeting all of the needs, and then the existing carrier was given an opportunity to cure. And then they'd have to have a second hearing to see whether or not they had managed to cure the defect. Well, it just made it an incredibly long process.
Some of us remember what happened in Louisiana, New Orleans. Garvey's had the control over the whole process. Nobody could get into New Orleans because the PUC will never ever issue a second company license because they were so much in bed with Garvey's. So for years, there was nobody else other than just a radiophone of New Orleans that was the Garvey's. You remember
Well,
that?
the environment in LA was quite the opposite, right?
Yes.
There were 8 of us.
Right.
Yes.
There was a little group out there in Pomona, one in Long Beach, out in the San Fernando Valley. You had mobile phone in LA. You had us who happened to have mountaintops. So
Then you had me.
we had coverage and you, exactly. We had radio relay or graphic scanning. And we all had licenses. And what's really interesting about this is that it's probably one of the first in computer history, one of the first times that a computer, which Marty delivered from Motorola, I didn't know him at the time, had this capacity, and we had all 8 paging companies time sharing.
Right.
And there were 2 channels, so there were 4 companies time sharing on one channel, one of the guard band channels.
158.7 and 152.24.
152.24.
Never forget them.
Yeah, and the other 2 on these other channels. And it was all about managing that little tiny speck of frequency between 4 companies.
Right.
And I think by the time we actually left the paging business, there were probably 250,000 pagers,
Wow.
beepers.
Well,
in Los
and see,
Angeles.
that shows the value of competition, because in a number of markets, where the state commissions were giving a sole franchise, I mean, it didn't develop nearly as much. I remember Norm Jorgensen told me a story about a client of his. I think he was in a relatively small market in the Midwest, and they were having a big medical convention there. And so all the doctors were coming in from out of town. This was before nationwide paging, right? So they all wanted to get a pager so that they could be reached while they were at the convention. And so the local carrier had a booth at the convention where you could come in and you could sign up for a pager. So you'd go in to sign up for a pager. Convention lasted 2 days, okay? Minimum contract period, 2 months. 1 month on, and then you had a month cancellation. And you had to pay for the 2 months in advance. So in order to get a pager, you basically had to pay for 2 months of paging, and then the guy would sit at the table and people would say, oh, that's outrageous. And he says, well, why don't you go to my competition? And they say, well, who's your competition? He says, I don't have any.
Wow.
Carl, this interview won't be complete without us recognizing what Arlene did. Arlene, if you would touch on the program you started, for the kidney patients.
Well, one of the things that was happening at the same time that the technology of communications was improving was the technology of organ transplant, the medical research that was going on that allowed people to, who needed them to get kidneys or lungs and so on. And this was all brand new in the mid-70s. And in about 1978 or so, my brother read an article in the newspaper about a young man who was waiting, a child who was waiting for some sort of organ transplant. I've forgotten. I think at the time, the only transplant that had been perfected was the kidney transplants. Mm-hmm. And so somehow, well, maybe this had to do with the fact that his mom couldn't work because she needed to be at a phone, and the work that she didn't allow her to do that. So I guess Russ figured out, well, if she had a beeper, then they could beep her.
Russ being your brother.
Yeah, Russ is my brother.
Right.
And so he set up to have her get get a beeper so that doctors could get a hold of her, the organ transplant teams. And that process started a whole structure for the industry. It ended up moving from our operation as something we called LifePage into the National Association, which at the time was called Telecator. And it turns out that Telecator helped take that program nationwide, so that by the time we ended that program, when cellular really got intense out in the late 90s, paging was sort of dying off. I think the number that I saw was 60,000 people had enjoyed the use pro bono while they're waiting for transplants. So it was quite a,
That's
it was
quite
the
a success.
first,
And so many lives were saved.
yeah, consumer healthcare. It was the first wireless healthcare application, even though it was only beeping. So it just started to show how valuable that could be to not only industry and the medical industry, but also patients and their families.
Well, it is ironic that the beginning of the wireless industry was hospitals, doctors,
Right.
because if you look at what the future of our industry is, at some point, cellular is getting to be a competitive business, which isn't really today,
Right.
and we're going to start using cell phones more efficiently, and our healthcare will be totally dependent on being connected.
Yep.
We'll have sensors in our body and we'll be monitored continuously, and before we contract a disease, we'll know about it. The doctors will know about it. We'll teach you how to eliminate that.
Right.
So the future of wireless communication is going to be connected people who will live longer and be without disease, all because of wireless technology.
One of the things that I'd like to touch on, and it seems to me we have at least two people here who could be experts in this, is, paging started out as essentially a local business.
Right.
And then it evolved into a nationwide business. So how did that happen?
Okay, let me give you the history on that, because I was involved when it was local. When if you have a system, you could only cover 10, 15 miles radius from the city. And then you go out, you lose coverage. There used to be a company called Quintron. You remember Quintron?
Sure,
Arlene?
absolutely.
Yeah, Quintron. And there's a fellow there, Dennis Cameron, who was the author of what we call simulcast paging. He developed a technology where you could install one transmitter in the market, then you go out 15 miles, have another transmitter on the same frequency. So multiple transmitter by expanding. So, and these transmitters would not interfere with each other.
Wow.
So he had developed the technology. The simulcast technology led from a local paging to what we call the wide area paging. In paging, how you sell your product was based on how big a coverage you have. That was the claiming point.
Edge,
yeah.
sure.
So people start expanding and they start going into region. For example, we were in Chicago. We expanded Chicago, big time. Then we got to take it to Milwaukee to make it a regional page to compete with the guys who were only offering Chicago. So we made that a regional type. So you could go between Chicago and Milwaukee and not have to notify anyone. Then in 1980, MCCA, that was my company, John Palmer, who was the chairman CEO, he filed with the FCC a petition for a frequency for nationwide paging. And it was the 931 paging. We filed the petition for the 931 and we got given. So we implemented a nationwide system with the help of a Motorola. Motorola worked very closely with us in the development of nationwide paging. Motorola, throughout our paging, Skytel was a big partner of our company. So with the help of Motorola, we developed the nationwide paging technology. So now you could go from one place to the other, not have to notify anyone. And the one thing which I think we touched on, why did doctor prefer paging over cellular? Paging, because we had transmitters, they were 500 power, 1,000 kilowatt ERP, versus cellular. They didn't have that too many sites in the first evolution.
Right.
So paging could provide coverage in buildings, in basements, where cellular could not provide.
That's true.
I'm really glad you brought up the simulcast idea, although I don't want to get into a competitive discussion here, but Motorola did come up with that concept because just in case there are any engineers watching, this was not simulcast. It was, these frequencies were not identical. They were deliberately spaced, maybe 10 hertz or 50 hertz separate,
Right.
so that you never had two transmitters exactly
Hitting the same
interfering
pager
with
at the
each
same
other.
time. That's
Yeah.
interesting.
So, and in order to do that, you need precision frequency, and it happens that one of my businesses at that time was building high precision oscillators.
Right.
So I get to sell an oscillator for every Metro 100 and every Metro 10 that existed that did simultaneous transmission.
Yeah, Marty, if you recall, we were able to do simulcasting in the VHF band, in the UHF band, in the 900. For one reason, for the low band, 35 megahertz, we could not do simulcast. Those channels basically became low quality frequencies.
Well, and the way it was explained to me, but you're the engineer, you can tell me, the wavelength was so big that it couldn't get through windows.
Yeah, the penetration was
building penetration was terrible,
Terrible, yeah.
because of just the size of the wavelength of the low band.
Right.
And so, I mean, we'd have people come and say, gee, I want to file for a paging channel. And we'd say, well, there's a 35 megahertz channel or there's a 43 megahertz channel. They say, oh, no, I don't want low band. Yeah.
So let me continue with we got into nationwide. We filed a petition with the FCC for two-way, which was very high capacity. And the goal of a two-way was it had to be high capacity, had to be nationwide, had to be location independent, and had to be guaranteed message delivery. You know what the guaranteed message delivery was? First it said location independent. If I had a two-way pager, when we designed the system, you leave from Washington, D.C., you go to Atlanta, you should not have to tell that you're going. When you get to Atlanta, your pager will notify the network and will update where you are.
Right.
So location
Wow.
independent. Secondly, if somebody called you, left a message for you while you were in transit, that message will not be discarded. When you landed in Atlanta and sent the message, I'm in the new market, your message which was
Stored and forward, yeah.
will go back to delivered. And once you got delivery, the sending party got the acknowledgement. Yes,
Oh, wow.
your message has been delivered. So these were two-way pagers.
Yeah, two-way. So we call that guaranteed message delivery. So location independent, high capacity, and guaranteed message delivery.
So you can see, like I had mentioned earlier, hundreds of techniques were learned by the technologists, the business offices, the people that ran these systems. Hundreds of techniques were learned and discarded or kept. Like that's very much a roaming concept rolled right into the cellular, the work that we did in cellular.
Our message concept of the two-way delivery
Yeah,
of guaranteed
exactly.
and the text messaging Unfortunately, we sold SkyTel to MCI WorldCom, which had the accounting problem and went into bankruptcy. And MCI WorldCom, somebody bought the patents out of bankruptcy code, and they bought our two-way patents. And they discovered that cellular companies, Apple, Motorola, Samsung, they were all violating our company's patent on two-way messaging, text messaging. And they won every case, and most of the cases were settled. And I was subpoenaed to testify in favor of the people who bought the patents. But some of that technology, if you see that SkyTel, a two-way technology, is embedded in every cell phone.
But I'll bring up one other thing that happened in my company in particular is the effort that we made to manage our business. This was not about managing RF. This was about managing 100,000 of those floating around Los Angeles, going in and out, and being able to create relationships with customers that allowed us, and systems, brand new computer systems that allowed us to actually know where all that inventory was. And so, for example, one of the things that we did very early on was support a remoted provisioning system that is activating pagers for one of our biggest customers. Southern California Edison had hundreds of pagers in their network around Los Angeles, and we remoted their ability to manage their inventory inside of their business so that they could then provision their devices onto our network. So it was self-provisioning system. That was just never even considered back in the mid
And in those days, did the end users generally own their pagers, or were they rented from the company?
Well, it depended, but most of our customers rented. So all of those assets were ones that we were paying for.
Right, and had to keep track of.
And we were, in my family business, all of us, all my two brothers and my father and I, all had signed over our homes and our kids and our dogs and everything we had so that we could borrow to buy.
Right.
And this device was $260
Wow.
at the time.
Wow.
So in 1973, 75, $78, they were really expensive.
Wow.
Yeah, and these things were repaired. There were a lot of page repair shops.
I should append to your comment that a lot of the funding for those pagers you talked about were provided by Motorola.
Right.
Well, they were provided by a capital resource that Motorola arranged for us.
Right.
Right.
That's a detail.
Details.
And Arlene, what happened is some of the small carriers which were not well funded, they took on that deal, getting the pagers funded, basically, and then giving away the pagers. Eventually, they built up their balance sheet, so negative balance sheet, they had to go bankrupt because they.
Who was that?
I can't recall the company, but there were quite a few of them who got into, get into the paging business. You don't need the capital. You can get these pagers and then put them in service, and you're basically collecting they were not even renting them. They were collecting from the service revenue.
You may be talking about some resellers.
Yes, I'm talking about resellers. Yes,
yeah. Now, we were the first ones in history to resell wireless access. All of our resellers were, I would say, I don't think any of them went bust on our network. Mm-hmm. And what we had done is discounted the RF services that we were signaling. Mm-hmm. And they were contracting direct with Motorola to buy their equipment. Mm-hmm. And most of those companies had niche markets. So for example, there was a guy that had a couple of apartments right at the end of the north runway at LAX, Los Angeles Airport. He had relationships with all the reserve crews that were flying for the airlines. And when they went on reserve, they'd stop at his apartment, pick up their pager. And their flight dispatch, their crew dispatches would dispatch for those crews. He covered the entire airport. There was no way you could do anything about. I mean, he was a monopolist of the LA airport, and he had a great business. We had other people that were serving the Korean community in downtown LA, and others out in San Bernardino that were an answering service. So I think by the time we sold our business to Metro Media, we had 30, 40 resellers. And they were all doing a great job selling. But I don't know of any of them that
Yeah, because
defaulted.
they kept on getting these books from this, financing them, and they ultimately, you know, they owed so much money, and they were not really collecting enough money to pay back the monthly payment on the loan.
Wow. Well, I know when we sold our business and I was responsible for our inventory and accounts receivable, we had sold tens of thousands of pagers or rented them. And we had lost 56 total.
Wow.
And our accounts receivable were really tight. We had, you know, it was really tight. So that's what systems did for us.
Yeah.
But a lot of the RCCs, even the big ones, didn't have systems to manage their business. And what you found out about maybe these people you're talking about, it's really hard to manage that kind of business without automation.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
There's too many numbers that you have to keep track of, because every one of those has a different number
Right.
and a different signaling thing and so on.
Why don't we go around and see if we have any last thoughts?
Sure. And I want to talk to our audience. We've talked a lot about technology in this session, but I want to remind everybody that the essence of the Wireless History Foundation, of the wireless history itself, of the paging industry, is the fact that it's the human experience that's really important. And the one thing that I talked about throughout my career, in fact, I've memorized it so much I don't even have to think about it anymore, is the following. People are mobile. They're essentially, naturally mobile. You know that every time you look at the nearest freeway. Nobody is where they want to be. Everybody is going somewhere else. And yet, for 100 years, at the time we started this industry, the phone company, you remember the Bell system, told us that the only way people could communicate with each other was with a wire connecting you. With the wireless history, it shows how technology has solved that problem, and that industry is just starting to build up steam. Our lives have been improved enormously in the past, even more so in the future.
Yeah, I would say that you know the wireless industry has made tremendous progress. You know what we talked about early on in 1970, two-tone paging, no tone paging, where people had to call in and pick up the message, and the overall the speed and the technology. But one area where I don't know why we have not made progress. I have this phone, but I'm afraid about 10 o'clock, I'm going to run out of the battery. The battery life, so I'm carrying a spare battery with me. You know, when we did our two-way system, our objective was that if the battery had to last 30 days, a double A battery, the battery life in cell phone has not made any progress over the last many generations. I think there's a lot of work to be done for the public convenience, for the real good application of cell phone, use of cell phone, that we must come up with a longer battery life. I don't have my Apple Watch here. I didn't want to carry the charger because it doesn't last that long.
Right.
So, challenge for the wireless industry, do something about the battery life of a cell phone or the wireless device.
The cellular business is a wonderful business, and the wireless business today is a wonderful business. But the thing I miss the most about the paging business is that the companies were run by entrepreneurs who were just really interesting people. I mean, Homer Harris was one of a kind. I mean, and all of the, well, not all of them. I mean, AirSignal was a publicly traded company, but I think it was just about the only one until PageNet came along later.
MCCA.
Yeah, MCCA, right.
And then Skytel too, yes.
And there was just something nice about working for entrepreneurs. You'd be dealing with the decision makers. You didn't have to kind of go up through the chain of command to get, 3 weeks to get a decision on what seemed like a fairly simple question. And I miss that. It was just an interesting industry with some real, interesting people in it.
I guess I would add to that there are dozens of people that I miss. Right.
Yeah, no, I understand. Mm-hmm. No, I understand.
Should I talk about you and me?
Oh, no.
Yeah, I want to hear that.
Well, I really have to say this because, the Motorola that created all the technology that we've been talking about here doesn't exist anymore. But we should remember that without the vision of not only we engineers, but the management as well, who really understood the impact of the paging industry to create that industry so that you entrepreneurs could end up providing such a great service for the public. I think that ought to be remembered as well.
Yeah. Oh, I agree.
For my company, Motorola, it was a key partner. We did everything with the Motorola, like the two-way development. We signed up a $500 million order with the Motorola to build nationwide network. And they helped us develop the two-way pager. The two-way reflex pager was done by, we developed the core technology, Motorola took over, and we had done the protocol which we handed over to Motorola. And so they're great partners for us.
And there were dozens and dozens of companies that came and went that contributed to the advancement of what we did. We had terminal makers. We had some guys that came in with pagers, went out, came in, and so on. But it was vibrant. I can remember our first conventions. Motorola would set up their display on a table just like this. And they'd have, a mobile radio there and a control head over there and maybe some devices or whatever. It was really, really early.
Well, look, thank you all. Great conversation. I think we did the paging industry proud.